Welcome, brave souls, to DrConjuring, a place where the dead still whisper and horror stories come to life. Before we begin, the spirits have a question. How far do our tales travel? Tell us in the comments, because something is always listening. If you crave more darkness, more horror stories that linger long after the lights go out, please like this video and subscribe. Your support feeds the shadows, helping us create even more terrifying stories. We truly do appreciate it, and so do they. Now, let's begin. But be warned, some stories never let go. My grandfather was a combat pilot. He was a quiet man, distant even. As a child, I always thought he just wasn't the affectionate type. But as I got older, I realized something else. He was always aware, always watching, always waiting for something. My mother told me he wasn't always like that something changed in him when he came back from Vietnam. Maybe it was PTSD, shell shock, whatever name you want to give it. But something had left a permanent mark on him. Maybe that's why I became obsessed with space, astronauts, planes, and pilots. He never seemed eager to talk about his past, but when it came to aviation, I could get him to open up. He was a highly skilled and well-respected officer in the military, and through his connections, he even knew a few astronauts. One day, as a naive kid, I asked if he had ever met someone who had been to the moon. He stiffened. The warmth drained from his face, and for a long time he just stared at me. Finally, he muttered, "Don't ever talk to me about the moon, boy. It's a dark and evil place." Then he looked away, his gaze unfocused, lost in some distant, unseen horror. His hands, rough and weathered from years of work, trembled as he reached for his coffee, but he didn't take a sip. Instead, he set the mug down, his fingers tapping absently against the ceramic, the rhythmic sound filling the silence between us. I waited, expecting him to say more, but he didn't. He just sat there, breathing deeply, like a man trying to suppress something clawing its way up from the depths of his memory. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "We weren't alone up there." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" His eyes darted to me, filled with something between fear and regret. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. After a moment he let out a bitter chuckle and shook his head. "Doesn't matter. No one ever believes me anyway." I did. I believed him. The raw terror in his expression was too real to be anything but truth. But just as I was about to push further, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Forget it," he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. "Just forget I said anything." I never got the chance to ask him again. He died in 2004. Natural causes, they said. That's what the coroner's report claimed, at least. But anyone who knew him, really knew him, would tell you there was nothing natural about it. It happened on a cold October night. He was found in his study, slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. His eyes wide, bloodshot, seemed to be staring at something that wasn't there. His fingers were curled, claw-like, as if he'd tried to grab onto something or fight something off. The old wooden floor beneath his chair was scratched, as though he had desperately tried to push himself away from his desk before whatever happened took him. There were deep bruises around his neck, but no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no fingerprints other than his own. The door was locked from the inside. The window was shut tight. His death left more questions than answers. In the days leading up to it, he'd become restless, paranoid even. He barely slept. He jumped at the smallest noises. He kept his curtains drawn, muttering about shadows moving where they shouldn't. My grandmother found him one night, just standing in the backyard, staring up at the sky, whispering under his breath. "Them stars ain't right," he had murmured. "They're watching, waiting." Then, one evening, he made a phone call. My father told me he overheard part of it. My grandfather was speaking in a hushed, desperate tone to someone he hadn't spoken to in decades. My father only caught a few words before my grandfather noticed him and slammed the door shut. "They found me," he had whispered into the receiver. "I don't know how, but they found me." 2 days later, he was dead. The police shrugged it off. No signs of foul play, no toxins in his system, just heart failure, they said. An old man, living with too many ghosts. But I never believed that. Because after he died, strange things started happening. The house felt different, colder. His study, where he was found, always had this lingering scent of burnt metal, though no fire had ever been reported. At night, my grandmother swore she could hear faint tapping sounds coming from inside the walls. The attic door would creak open on its own. And then there was the note. A single yellowed scrap of paper found tucked inside his desk drawer. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic. Just 6 words, scrawled unevenly, as if written by a trembling hand. "Don't let them see the box." I had no idea what it meant. Not then. But a few months ago, we started renovating my grandparents' old house. While clearing out the attic, I stumbled upon a small rusted metal box buried beneath a pile of forgotten junk. Inside, I found a stack of old papers, a military medal, and a strange, faded photograph. My grandfather was in it, younger than I had ever seen him. He was flanked by 2 other men, both unfamiliar to me. They were all wearing spacesuits. It wasn't an ordinary NASA photo. There was no NASA logo, no mission insignia, just a blank monochrome backdrop. But my eyes caught something else. A barely visible patch on their suits. The word Dawnbreaker was stitched into the fabric. I had never heard of such a mission. I searched for it everywhere. No records. No mentions in declassified documents. Nothing. At the bottom of the metal box, beneath everything else, was a set of yellowed folded pages. A letter. My grandfather's handwriting. My dear family, if you are reading this, then I have failed in keeping the truth buried. I hope you never had to know. But if you have found this, then you deserve to understand what I was a part of. I never set foot in Vietnam in 1972. That was just a story they gave my family. The truth is far worse. He went on to explain that, in the mid-60s, a select group of elite pilots had been secretly recruited. They were trained for covert space missions, hidden from the public, concealed even from most of NASA. They weren't the men whose names would be written in history books. They were sent on missions the government couldn't afford to acknowledge. In early 1972, we were informed that a secret satellite had been orbiting the moon. Its purpose was never disclosed to us. But weeks before, it had crashed onto the dark side of the moon. We were sent to retrieve its data. We were given Apollo-grade equipment, the kind intended for a mission that never officially happened. The Apollo astronauts were furious that their mission had been scrapped in favor of ours, but it didn't matter. We weren't NASA. We were something else, something bigger. My grandfather was the mission commander. Alongside him were Lieutenant Carver, the lunar module pilot, and Lieutenant Ackerman, the command module pilot. It took them 3 days to reach the moon. The descent was smooth. They landed in the shadowed depths of a vast, jagged crater. When we stepped onto the surface, the first thing that hit me was the silence. I expected emptiness, but this was something different. It felt like something was holding its breath, waiting. They found the crashed satellite easily enough, but they weren't the first ones there. There were tracks, footprints, deep and unmistakable, surrounding the wreckage, leading away from it. But not ours. and not human. They followed the tracks. With each step, their oxygen dwindled, their time running out. But something compelled them forward. Then, in the distance, they saw it. A spacecraft, but not theirs. A Soviet lander. It shouldn't have been there. The Russians didn't have a lunar program that could put men on the moon. But there it was, and it had been there for a long time, longer than us. They tried to make contact. No response. The spacecraft was eerily silent. The windows had been obscured. Something had been smeared across the inside of the glass. They forced their way in. The smell hit us first. Not rot, not decay, but something worse. The interior was wrecked, food packets torn open, and something else. Brownish red stains splattered across the walls, the controls, the seats. 2 seats, one empty, the other occupied. The Soviet cosmonaut's suit was intact, but his visor had been shattered from the inside. His helmet was filled with something dark, something that had once been liquid. There was another suit hanging nearby. The name patch had been torn off. There had been 2 of them. One was still out there. They left, rushed back to their lander. But as they neared, something changed. The wreckage, the Soviet lander, it wasn't there anymore. We had passed it on the way, but now, nothing, as if it had never existed. That night my grandfather had a dream. I walked across the lunar surface, following a flickering light in the distance. As I approached, I saw a spacesuit, crumpled in the dust. The limbs were bent at impossible angles, as if whatever had been inside had been broken and discarded. The helmet was turned toward me. The visor was cracked, and beneath the glass I saw my own face, staring back at me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat as an unnatural silence filled the room. It wasn't just my reflection. It couldn't be. The face behind the cracked visor was pale, lifeless, yet its eyes. They weren't quite mine. They were hollow, sunken, like something that had been staring into darkness for too long. A deep chill spread through my chest. I blinked, and for the briefest second, the reflection changed. My features warped, my mouth twisted open as if screaming, but no sound came out. My eyes blackened into empty pits. A shudder ran through my body, and I jerked back, knocking the helmet from its perch. It hit the ground with a dull, metallic clunk. The moment it touched the floor, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped. A low, distant hum filled my ears, like radio static mixed with something else. Something almost whispered. I turned away, but in my peripheral vision, I swore I saw movement inside the visor. A flicker of something. Not quite there. I hesitated, then slowly crouched down, reaching out to touch it. My fingers barely brushed the surface when a sharp, stinging sensation jolted through my hand, like a sudden electric shock. I yanked my arm back, my fingertips numb and tingling. The humming grew louder. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, bending unnaturally along the walls. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. Only the faint sound of my own breathing remained. The helmet lay motionless on the floor, its visor now dull and empty, just a lifeless piece of glass and metal. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. Because in that moment, a single thought took root in my mind. An idea that made no sense. Made less than no sense, but clung to me nonetheless. Somewhere, out there, beyond the reach of Earth, something had worn that helmet. Something had seen me, and somehow it still did. When they returned to Earth, they were sworn to secrecy. The mission never happened. The records were erased. But my grandfather was never the same. He had seen something out there, something he could never explain. The last words of his letter sent a shiver through me. They told us that the dark side of the moon is just a name, that it sees the sun as often as the side we know. But they lied. We weren't the first to walk there, and we weren't alone. I burned the letter that night, but I haven't stopped dreaming since. That was tonight's chilling tale from DrConjuring's channel. If it sent shivers down your spine, please give us a like. It's completely free and helps us share these eerie stories with more brave souls like you. And if you're craving even more bone-chilling horror that will haunt your nights, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You'll never miss a new upload, each story more terrifying than the last, delivered straight to your inbox. Thank you so much for listening. We truly appreciate every one of you. Good night, and remember, sleep with one eye open. You never know what might be watching. Ha ha.